Thank you. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to spend some time to talk about some of the cutting-edge neuroscience research that has been elucidating some of the mechanisms that may underlie the therapeutic response that we see in our clinical trials. So this will be both a non-clinical and clinical data presentation. So we'll be looking at the translational type of data that we collect from these different types of studies. And one thing with animal studies is that we can really get a closer look at what's going on in the brain and the body, and this may lead to the discovery of new drugs, or it may help us to understand why some people respond to a treatment and why some people may not. So taken together with the animal literature and the limited amounts of neuroimaging data we have from humans with MDMA, I think we have a pretty compelling case that there is a biological basis for MDMA in a therapeutic context. So MAPS completed 6 phase 2 clinical trials from 2004 to 2016, and the data was quite remarkable, showing that people could recover from post-traumatic stress disorder with a limited number of doses of MDMA in the context of psychotherapy. So this led the FDA to designate this treatment as a breakthrough therapy, and we are now in the midst of doing our phase 3 clinical trials. So the therapeutic approach, we heard quite a bit from Marcella, but this was described in a manual that you can find on our website. And the general premise is that people are first prepared to go through MDMA sessions that last all day, and the sessions occur in a controlled clinical setting with a male and female co-therapy team. And they really are encouraged to have various periods of going within, as well as coming out and talking about what may be arising for them, and going through a really deep therapeutic processing around the traumas that they have experienced. So when we think about how MDMA works during psychotherapy, we really have to think about the several different dimensions, including the psychological factors, the neurological factors, and then also how the environment can interact with these different components. So we're going to go through these different factors during this talk, and there probably are many others that aren't even listed here, such as anti-inflammatory effects in the gut biome, so as well as the spiritual and psychospiritual dimension. So there's a lot that we can still include in how MDMA may be working. So what I'm showing here is an image of a neuron and a synapse. And so this is a serotonin neuron. And whenever MDMA is ingested, we see that it can then enter these transporter proteins that normally would take serotonin back into the cell. And they're able to release serotonin from the vesicles where they are stored. And this leads to a release of serotonin into the synapse, where it can activate receptors and also release other neurochemicals. This is a similar process for dopamine and norepinephrine. MDMA activates all of these transmitters, but with the greatest extent on the serotonergic system. So in short, MDMA acts like these sly foxes opening the gates for the sheep to get out and do their work in the brain. And these neurotransmitters do enhance the release of other neurohormones, including oxytocin, prolactin, vasopressin, and cortisol. So fear conditioning and extinction is an animal model that's used to model post-traumatic stress disorder. And so in this paradigm, an animal is presented with a foot shock and an unconditioned stimuli, the tone. And after some pairings of the shock and the tone, the animal will then freeze in response to just the sound. And this is a classical conditioning type of paradigm, and can be thought of similar to how people may start to associate triggers in an environment if someone does develop PTSD. So during fear extinction training, the tone is then played, but without the shock. And after a number of times of just the tone presentation, the animal will learn that it no longer signifies that the shock is coming. So this model was used at Emory University, and they wanted to investigate the effects of MDMA if it was given just before the extinction training. So they delivered either MDMA or saline to these animals, and what they found was that MDMA reduced the freezing response during the training sessions as well as the day after to the testing of the conditioned response. So this really signifies that MDMA was able to speed up the forgetting of the paired stimuli, the trigger of the fear response. So they went on to show that this was dependent on brain-derived neurotropic factor, increased release in the amygdala, and that when they abolished the increase in BDNF, the response was inhibited. And this signaling molecule is very important for neuroplasticity, which is the basis for learning. And so when we think about what that may mean during our psychotherapy trials, is that if we're opening this window where the brain is more able to learn or adjust new behaviors, then this does support a model of learning during our therapy sessions. There was another researcher that has done some studies in cells that showed that not only MDMA, but other classic psychedelics, that they all converged on this pathway of BDNF, mTOR, which can induce structural and functional plasticity, meaning that there could be more synapses made in new dendritic branches after psychedelics. And they are now doing some research to see if they just target this pathway without the psychedelic side effects, if this may be a potential treatment for people. It's really interesting research, but there is a lot of people that feel the psychological effects are a key part to what we see during psychotherapy. But nonetheless, this is really fascinating work that's being done after people have gotten interested in studying psychedelics due to the therapeutic effects we're seeing in the clinical trials. So memory reconsolidation is a distinct neural process from fear extinction, and during memory reconsolidation, an established memory can be reactivated and then modified or changed based on the context and information present in the moment. And so during our psychotherapy trials, there is a lot of recall of traumatic memories, but it's in the context of safety and a supportive setting with a co-therapy team. And so it may be that these memories of trauma, when they're reactivated in this context, could be modified through a protein-dependent mechanism to be stored back in the brain in a way that is resolved and less triggering for someone. So this was described by a participant in the study who said, one thing that MDMA facilitates is thinking about traumatic experiences in a neutral, safe manner. I could objectively think about them and talk about them. Then it seems those memories are put back in their place in the brain in a different configuration, a configuration that does not cause as many problems, such as bad dreams, intrusive thoughts, or having horrible insomnia. This has continued to this day, a year and a half after the last MDMA session. So while we haven't been able to formally investigate or test memory consolidation, it does seem that the right brain regions are involved in the MDMA response. And to this date, we still haven't done any neuroimaging studies of people with PTSD and given them MDMA while their brains are being scanned. But we do have some data from healthy controls. And this is a number of different studies that are represented in this chart. But basically what people have shown is that there's an increase in connectivity between the hippocampus, which is very important for memory, and the amygdala, which is very important for emotions and especially the fear response. There's also a decrease in connectivity with the prefrontal cortex, which is more of a cognitive control. And so it may be that there's this bottom-up processing of emotions and memories during MDMA administration. there's still a lot that we can learn about, that we'll be able to learn from MDMA as more studies are conducted. And there is one at Yale University right now that will be investigating people with PTSD and giving them MDMA while they're being scanned. And it's also important to keep in mind that the task that people are doing in the scanner can really impact what you're measuring in the brain with these types of studies. So now we're going to talk about the prosocial behavior that's associated with MDMA. This is a well-established effect. And there's some research that was recently done at Stanford where they wanted to see if they injected mice with MDMA and let them explore into this chamber that has 3 different sides. And they had different conditions where on one side it was just an empty cage. On the other side, they had another mouse. And so they measured the activity of the free mouse and found that MDMA increased the amount of time that the free mouse would spend with the cage mouse. And they wanted to understand, so this is just a graph showing that difference between saline and MDMA when the mouse was treated. So then they wanted to manipulate what would happen if they gave the caged mouse a dose of MDMA and let the free moving mouse move around. And they saw a little bit of an increase in the amount of time spent with the caged mouse. And when they gave the caged mouse and the free moving mouse MDMA, they found that the effect was double and that there was a lot more social interaction between these animals, which is quite reflective, I think, of how people in non-medical settings often congregate around when they take MDMA. So they really wanted to understand what are the mechanisms behind this, and they did some pretty advanced techniques to show that to measure the brain activity of the free-moving mouse. And this is a heat map showing the serotonergic activity of the free-moving mouse as he explored. And so there's a lot more activity happening around the mouse that was caged, which is really signifying that the serotonin response is very important for the prosocial behaviors that are observed in these animals. So in another lab, they showed that MDMA could make adult mice brains and adult mice respond to social reward in a similar way to how adolescents do. So this idea that you're more inclined to want to be with friends when you're younger, and as you get older, that value is maybe less, or you can do less time with being solo, and that rewarding time with friends is less important. But what they found was that by giving MDMA to these animals, that it made them more like an adolescent, and that this response was related to oxytocin release in the nucleus accumbens. So there is some interesting studies now really looking at what is the contribution of both serotonin or oxytocin in these different behaviors. So what happens if you block the MDMA binding site? So this is a study from some genetically modified mice that no longer have that serotonin transporter that is so important for releasing the neurotransmitters. And they showed that by deleting this, that you no longer see this increase in serotonin in the nucleus accumbens. You can also do this with an SSRI antidepressant. So this will actually block that receptor. And when you gave MDMA, then you see that it no longer has a place to release the transmitters that are necessary for the subjective effects. So this is the same group that did the fear extinction study, and they wanted to administer citalopram for 21 days to see how this might impact the MDMA response. And what they found was when they administered this chronic SSRI, in the days after when they tested the animals in fear extinction, that the MDMA was no longer working, and that they responded the same to the saline-treated animals. So this is really important to think about, because a lot of people that join our studies have been prescribed SSRIs. These are the 2 approved FDA medications right now for PTSD, which include Paxil and Zoloft. And so to join our study, people have to taper off the medications because we really want to test the effect of our treatment. But the thing with these compounds is one of the ways they work is that it desensitizes or internalizes the serotonin transporter or dopamine transporters. And it can take several weeks or months for the homeostasis of the brain, the system to reset, and for these receptors to be reinserted into the membrane. And so this is part of the mechanisms of why people can go through discontinuation syndrome or experience withdrawal effects or have a difficulty stopping SSRI treatments. So we wanted to look at people that had enrolled in MAP studies, to look at people that had tapered or people that didn't taper off of these medications. And so what we found was that at baseline, they had very similar scores on our PTSD measure, the CAPS. But at the primary endpoint, after going through 2 MDMA sessions, 2 to 3, we saw that the non-taper group had a much larger response to the treatment, and their scores dropped to 45.7, while the taper group had a much blunted response and only dropped 70.3. So this is a pretty huge difference in the treatment response that we observed. And then for the number that met PTSD diagnostic criteria, this differed too between the groups, with 63.6% reaching a remission, while 25.0% in the taper group did not. We also looked at the baseline scores of depression and saw the groups were relatively similar, but at the primary endpoint, the depression measure also showed that the non-taper group had a greater response. So there's a few ways to interpret this. It's possible that maybe people were not feeling so well from discontinuing or the taper, but we also wanted to look at the vital signs in these different groups because MDMA does increase blood pressure and heart rate and temperature. And when we looked at the 2 groups, we did see a difference in their physiological response to MDMA, in that the non-taper group had a greater increase in blood pressure. So this is really suggesting that there is a neurochemical basis to maybe the people that had tapered are not having the same response that we see in people that did not. But we didn't see a difference in the heart rate or body temperature. So environmental factors, we know with psychedelics that the setting is very important and can very much influence how people experience psychedelic. So I wanted to show a little bit of data that was collected here at the University of Texas when I was doing MDMA research back in early 2004. And at this time, it was very popular for people to be taking ecstasy at raves or in club-type settings. And so we wanted to know, how do these environments really influence the drug response? So we created a little rat rave and manipulated some variables with music and increasing the temperature of where the animals were self-administering MDMA. And what we found was that when you played music while MDMA was being administered, that there is a greater release of serotonin and dopamine, and that when you place them in a heated environment, there was a significantly greater increase in serotonergic response. It trended for dopamine, but didn't quite reach a difference between just MDMA and a no music, no rave scene. So this is really some interesting information that does kind of, I think, fit nicely with how important music is in the therapeutic context. Some people have even referred to music as the third therapist in the room because it can evoke such meaningful thoughts and emotions and help with meaning making of the experience. And so we haven't collected any data yet with MDMA and music in humans with neuroimaging, but there has been some research done with LSD and music, and it shows that there's a lot of the same brain regions that are activated that are involved with reward, emotion, and memory processing. So I think this is a really critical component to the psychotherapy that could, as we learn more, we can also work more with how people's preferences could be integrated more of the music that's played during the sessions. The other part of the environment that I think is probably playing a big role is the therapy team. So there can be, different dynamics with the team, and people that enroll in our studies are just assigned to whoever's available to see them. But if we do see this treatment post-approval, then people will have more of a choice of who they want to work with. And so it'll be interesting to find out, like, how do the qualifications of the training team affect the response? How does the personality and the dynamics of the people working in this space really impact how well people can respond to the treatment? And then lastly is the placebo effect. So this describes taking a pill that really has no biological activity and people see a response, or that you see a response greater than what can be explained by the pharmacological effects. And so with psychedelics, it's very difficult to blind these studies. People generally know if they have taken a psychedelic. And so some people have questioned, is this only a placebo response that we see? And there is a lot of data out there that shows the placebo response actually has a neurochemical basis. The most well characterized is the activation of your endogenous opioid system with release of endorphins whenever a placebo is taken. It can really reduce pain symptoms. It's also been shown that placebos can activate the reward pathway and inhibit the amygdala. So it may be that there is some contribution of the placebo effect, but to me, it seems like if we have found a way to amplify the natural healing process or to amplify self-directed neuroplasticity, then this would be a huge discovery, and maybe psychedelics could be used to amplify other medications' response because people really believe that they are able to heal and able to get over their symptoms. So it's something to think about. I mean, when people come to our studies, they have expectations from the media or publications. You have these two therapists in a very nurturing environment that are telling them that empowering them to heal themselves and to activate this inner healing intelligence, which is reflective of, if you have a cut on your arm, a doctor can make the conditions right by cleaning it or stitching it up. But really, it's the body that is able to create new skin cells and really heal the wound. So all of this and the pharmacological effects of MDMA, of shifting consciousness, and you've received this substance, could be playing into the response. But I actually don't see this as a negative, but more as a positive in that people can activate something internal. So in short, MDMA is very complex, and I think we will continue to add more lines to this bubble. And it's not that they they really interact together, and you can't think of these mechanisms separately because our model is that MDMA is combined with psychotherapy. And we have all these environmental variables that we can start to manipulate and hopefully improve the treatments and help people that maybe could respond better to have certain variables or settings that could improve the response when they go through our treatment. So with that, I'd just like to thank our MAP staff and all the people working in our sites. We have lots of information on our website if you want to learn more about this research. So thank you for your attention. I'm happy to take a few questions. Thank you. Okay.
Hello, thank you for all the work that you've been doing. I was wondering, have you also been researching any other supportive supplements that people take perhaps beforehand or afterwards or even during that have assisted perhaps in the long-term effects of working with MDMA? I know of certain things like whether it's the 5-HTPs, the piracetams, the cholines, the alpha-lipoic acids, or the reishis, and more. There's a lot out there. But I'm wondering what you guys have been doing looking into that, if there's anything that you guys are really excited about in acting as support with MDMA. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We haven't been looking at that in our clinical trials because we really are trying to focus in on MDMA and PTSD, and adding other substances is an interesting path for research. But right now, we're just trying to focus on MDMA itself, and it does seem like there could be other supportive substances or work or integration work as we learn more. Yeah. Okay, right there. Go ahead.
Hey, thank you so much, Alli, for your talk. I really appreciate it. My name is Kevin, and I'm a pharmacist. And what you said earlier in the talk about the SSRIs and tapering versus non-tapering was really interesting to me. So I wanted to ask you, based off of the research in that study, I know that currently in protocols for MAPS trials, for example, they require tapering off all antidepressants. So do you see the results of that study affecting how we might treat patients in the future with allowing them to stay on antidepressants, or how we might possibly integrate other types of therapies in working together with MDMA?
Yeah, I think it has a lot of clinical implications, and there's some interesting work that's been put out in Lancet Psychiatry talking about micro tapers of SSRIs. With MDMA, as I showed, it's really that binding site that's missing when people are currently on SSRIs or when they taper off. But it may be that you could give MDMA every 2 months instead of every month, or if possible, have a longer taper might help that. I think there's a lot of research that could follow this to help us understand in a clinical practice what might be recommended for people that want to go through this treatment and need a taper. Yep.
Thanks again for all the work that you're doing and your contribution to knowledge. My question's really similar to the first question that was asked. How do you deal or preemptively work with the infamous calm down that people often experience through recreational use?
Yeah, so we administer MDMA in the morning around 10 a.m. And people are asked to fast from midnight to 10 a.m. And so I think we don't really see the come down effect that is associated with non-medical use. I think it has something to do with the time of day it's administered, the preparation. People are well hydrated, they're well rested. It's a very supportive time. During the weeks after, sometimes people have dug up a lot of trauma and they could be still working in that process. So we do advise people to take good care in the days and week following. But I think it's a much different risk factors for that in non-medical use, whether it's the purity of the drug or people staying up, dancing all night, that are disrupting their sleep schedules, that could contribute to any negative side effects after. But there is a lot of anecdotal reports, as she was saying, that maybe there are certain supplements or substances that sort of can help boost mood or help people with any type of negative effects they may experience after. Okay, I think I'm out of time now, so thank you so much.